Okay, we're back, and we're going to be talking in this chapter about the importance of converging evidence. All right, that sounds intriguing, so let's begin. Well, let's start with a nice philosophical concept called connectivity. I selected this background image because it shows lots of different little nodes, right? Each of those lights being connected to other lights. So it's a good model for what we're talking about, because with this philosophical concept, new explanations of phenomena must be connected to previous explanations. So you wouldn't want to see a new explanation come out of thin air and be unrelated to any of the previous explanations under this principle. So we always want to tie our new explanations to things that we've already explored, explanations that have been provided before. Now let's take a walk down memory lane and let's think about what term we have for explanations. Explanations of existing data. We call that a theory, right? So the principle of connectivity tells us that new theories, new explanations, must be connected to previous theories or previous explanations. So think about it like that, and we will give the little adjunct that new explanations must explain previously inexplicable data. In any theory, there is some aspect of the phenomenon that's probably not perfectly well explained. Probably something that they're like, that's an outlier. This theory can't really account for that part, but it accounts for all the other data. Everything else has been explained by this theory, but we have something that we haven't been able to account for. So when we look for a new explanation, we want to have a new explanation that will be able to explain things that previously hadn't been able to be explained, inexplicable data. And we also want the new explanation to be able to account for the previously accounted for data. So we don't want a new theory that can only explain the parts of the phenomena, the data, that previously hadn't been explainable, but it can't really account for what we have previously had a decent explanation for, right? We want to be able to explain both things with a new explanation. Otherwise, if we are only accounting for the previous data, it's not a very informative theory, is it? It's like, well, we already have a theory that accounts for the previous data. If it can only explain certain parts of the world, the inexplicable parts, but not account well for the previously known or understood parts, that's not very informative either. I think this will make a lot more sense if I use a nice concrete example from psychology, which is the theory of language acquisition. How do we as babies go from not able to speak a language at all to, by the age of 2, being able to communicate pretty decently? Like how, and then it really starts blossoming after that, right? So how does that happen? How do we acquire language? Well, the older theory came from Skinner. Skinner is our famous operant conditioning theorist, who was a very radical behaviorist who said we should only study the directly observable aspects of behavior. So he did a lot of research on rats and pigeons and other kinds of nonverbal creatures. And he did a pretty good job of explaining how reinforcement could shape them towards behaving in desirable ways, however the trainer wanted them to behave. And he made an argument that us humans, we've been reinforced towards the behaviors that we do the most often, and we've been punished away from the ones that we don't do that often. So that was his basic model. And he was always talking about directly observable behaviors. So a directly observable behavior would be the words that you utter, right? Those would be directly observable. We can hear them. We can write them down. We can read them if you wrote them down, right? So language makes good sense to be a subject to study in Skinner's paradigm. So he tried to explain how we could acquire a language through the model that he had developed, right? This idea that the things that we do the most are the things that we've been reinforced for, and the things that we don't do very often are the things we've been punished for. So he developed a little model, an explanation, we might say. So let's say that there's a stimulus out in the world and the child wants it, let's say. Now, I would just like to point out, Skinner wouldn't say the child wants it. because he doesn't know what's going on inside the child. Directly observable behavior would be the child saying cookie. So the child sees the cookie, says cookie, gets a cookie. Yay! Child reinforced for saying the word cookie. Through this process, Skinner says it becomes much more likely that in the future, when confronted with that same stimulus, that the child will utter that same response, cookie. Because last time they said cookie, they got a cookie. They're going to utter it again in the future, hoping that again they'll get a cookie. All right. Now that makes a lot of sense for certain aspects of language. Learning the names of things probably does occur through some kind of reinforcement. And reinforcement doesn't always have to be getting a cookie, right? It could be a smile, or my granddaughter likes to throw her arms up in the air, and then everybody who's near her, we all yell, yay! And then she throws her arms up in the air and we all go, yay! And that's really reinforcing. She's like controlling us, and she definitely finds it reinforcing. So she does it again in the future. So behaviors don't have to, the reinforcement doesn't have to be a food reward or money or something like that. It could be whatever the child finds reinforcing, right? We know it was a reinforcer because the child repeated the behavior. That's kind of how you know what a reinforcer is. Okay, so he explains like how they learn the names of words through this model. He explains why they would ever start uttering words, right? Because you can imagine that if you can say cookie in a world that has lots of things in it, being able to utter the name of the one that you want gets it a lot faster for you than if you have to point and hope the parents are following the line of your finger correctly. Oh no, you gave me an apple. I wanted the cookie. If only I could say cookie. So you could kind of imagine certain aspects of language being really well explained by this model. He talked about how children whose parents talk to them a lot have bigger vocabularies than children whose parents utter fewer words per day. He talked about children who are read to have larger vocabularies than children who are not read to. So he points to those examples as, see the child is being reinforced for using the words that they've been exposed to. And that's why they're repeating them. Okay, that's awesome. However, he never could satisfactorily explain one really class of universal errors that you see in every language around the world. I'm going to show you examples from English because that's what we all share. But these kinds of errors are expressed in all languages. So here's a common error where children over pluralize, right? He knows that to pluralize shoe, you would put S on the end, and so he put two S's at the end. Shoes, I could tie my shoes, right? It's really common to over pluralize, to add an S to something that already is plural, or to incorrectly conjugate irregular words, most commonly in the past tense. It's really common to hear children say things like goed or wented instead of just went. That's an irregular word. That's an irregular verb in the past tense. You have to just memorize that it's went. And so, hearing them say goed means that they are making this really common error. And it's very, like, all kids do it. You're my bestest friend. This is an example of the superlative. So you've heard these, mostest, bestest, things like that. These are all examples of really common errors in English. In other languages, you see different errors. I speak a little bit of Spanish, and a really common error is to misconjugate the verb saber in the first person. It should be, like, if it followed the normal rules, it would be sabo, but that's not how you conjugate that word. You conjugate it say. And so you can kind of tell if a person's a baby or a new speaker of the language, even as an adult, because they'll say sabo as they're misconjugating. It's really common to have in any language errors or irregular words that are not supposed to be treated the way that you typically treat words in that language. So Skinner had a lot of difficulty explaining why we make these kinds of errors. So he had a really good, decent theory for how maybe vocabulary is acquired. But he had this inexplicable set of data that he really struggled with. He tried to incorporate these errors into his theory, and he didn't do a very good job of it. It really was sort of the death knell for behaviorism when he attempted to incorporate universal errors into behaviorism, because he couldn't help but invoke some aspects of like internal mechanisms that are not supposed to be part of behaviorism. He said things like, things like the child wanted this or that, or that the child must have thought, and that's not part of behaviorism. So he struggled with it, really didn't do a good job of explaining these universal errors. And so it put behaviorism into limbo and the study of language into limbo for a while. So I'm going to have you transition into this video that shows Steven Pinker explaining these universal errors and how we can tell that these universal errors are due to something other than reinforcement. So go ahead and watch this video, and we'll come back and talk a little bit about what was in it.